EPL Playoffs. After 4 weeks of games with favourites prevailing, some failing and upsets along the way, and now CS2 leaving, we're at the end of a road with a single elimination playoff ahead. And that's where Scrawny is currently occupied. So I'll be taking you through this week's episode of Fantasy Focus, brought to you by 22Bet. This week on the Celebrity Leaderboard, we had success from an unlikely candidate. Darth Mike's pledge of allegiance to picking NA players when possible didn't work out last week when he went in on M80, but in Group D he has flown to the top of the pack, off the back of the flop. Riding Complexity's success and a fantastic performance from Floppy, bolstered with HooXi AWPing and holding that US flag. His roster also had HooXi and Monacy, a combo that felt must pick if you wanted to have a good team last week, given that HooXi farmed in his opening games. It's also looking like the top is going to tighten up, with 3 players looking to leapfrog into the top reaches. First up, Machine, with the VP Gamble, a cheaper G2 combo, and a little sprinkling of Grim. But notably, no Cloud9 players. A risky gambit, but one that looks to pay off. Vince did tap into Cloud9 with the Shiro Perfecto combo, but the budget dip into JT has put him into a better place than many who muddled with Minio. And Dinko is close on their tails with a rare scattershot approach. He's picked into 4 different teams, with Rainwaker providing an unexpected boon. Let's take a look at P2, who last week had the best team on the celebrity board. This time around, he wanted to go in on the VP Gamble and didn't pick a single G2 player. He's now on track for his worst performance yet. P2, those aren't mistakes you want to be making. With Prof and Scrawny having poor performances, this playoff event is about to get spicy. Over in the global leaderboard, Frita, who jumped from number 3 to number 1 last week, is solidifying that further with a top 10% finish. And this is actually one of Frita's worst drafts at EPL, where they got a 1% draft in Group A and Group C. That's 3 top 1% drafts for Frita this season. The secret to success? Making it rain with multiple gold players enabled by the right budget choices, a strategy that works well at EPL. Frita's team this time around featured 3 golds, with the Shiro Axile combo from Cloud9, enabled by the slightly cheaper Hunter HooXi combo. The player closest behind is MapGod, who went for the Dinko scattershot approach with this draft, with 4 different teams in play. The HooXi Monacy combo, of course, with Perfecto, Mer, and Voxic. And the gamble on the relatively cheap Turkish AWPer looked to pay dividends. These two are about to create a fairly sizable lead over the rest of the competition, but can they continue their run into playoffs? As we move into playoffs, there's some key things to keep in mind. Unlike the group stage, there's no lower bracket here. There's no last chance stage, no freebies for if your team falters. This is pure Counter-Strike, single elimination, only the best teams prevail. And what makes it exciting is that teams can start in 3 different stages depending on how well they did in groups. For teams that top their groups, they'll start in the quarterfinals. Teams that came second will start 1 stage back, and then teams that came 3rd or 4th, they start all the way at the beginning and have to run the full gauntlet. That means the way you utilize padding is key. Starting in the quarters means you get 6 points of padding per round that you don't play. So you start out the gate with 12 points. But the trade-off is you miss out on potential points that a player could get you if they have to do the full run from the start of the bracket. But here's a little tip. You can then utilize this padding to pick cheaper budget picks from teams that start deeper in the bracket. So even if your HooXis or Carrigans have a poor performance, it's kind of offset by that padding that you start with. Another 22Bet knowledge nugget. Now that we've returned to a more standard tournament structure, you should be picking a 2-2-1 team. With the way the EPL's bracket works here, we have 4 different branches, which means that you can pick players from teams that don't meet until the semi-final. And ideally, you'll have 4 players in that grand final. But let's talk drafting and let's talk Big Baller. I want to highlight Team Vitality, the #1 team in the world, and they are lit up in gold, with 4 players copping hefty price tags. Spinks and Zywoo are the most expensive players of the event. And of the 2, I want to suggest Spinks. He's currently the highest rated player of EPL. You can throw the multi-fragger role on him, which activates more often than not. Plus, he's 11k cheaper than ZywOo. So the fact that you miss out on those first 2 rounds of potential farming from an expensive player hurts a little bit less. If you want someone more for the AWP role, look towards m0NESY. 219k, he was an absolute menace in the group stage. His form in Malta has been fantastic. Plus, you can pair him up with HooXi for a nice, clean 400k. But if you're wanting something a little spicier, something with a little bit more potential, a bit more piazz, take a look at Astralis and take a look at Device and Blame F. They've had their prices reduced from 230 and 236k to 216 and 219 respectively. And Benjamin Bremer is the definition of big baller, the second highest rated player of groups, and critically, Astralis finished 3rd in their group, meaning that they'll be starting at the first round of playoffs, which means plenty of opportunities to get points. But it is the trade-off of risk versus reward. BlameF also has some interesting roles that you can choose, with Defender and notably Camper being quite high for him. I guess living up to the BaitF name. Now for our safe pick, we're looking at players from teams that are going to do a deep run at the event. We're also looking at players that perform no matter the pressure, no matter the level of competition or the opponent they face. So starting from the top, we take a look at Team Vitality as the #1 team, one of the favorites to go the full distance, and you have to look at Magisk. You can throw the multi-fragger or attacker role on him, whichever one you prefer. And yes, you can make the argument for Flamesy, but we're talking a safe pick, and Magisk is about the safest pair of hands you can find. With 75% of his matches in the last 3 months, and that's excluding show matches, he's had a positive rating. Now he might be a little bit too expensive for your taste, as he kind of verges on that big baller territory. As we go down the list of teams, JKS from G2 stands out. Yeah, he had a bit of an off performance at Gamers 8, but that actually works out to our advantage because it means he's a lot cheaper compared to the majority of his teammates. And we know the sort of numbers that he can provide. And in fact, he's been delivering them at EPL so far. He also has great activation on the support role. And finally, if you're believing in the new Na'Vi, then Bit at only 209k is very cheap relative to other top teams. He's a consistent star performer who's been doing great at EPL so far, and notably has incredible activation rate on the headshot machine role. Now I mentioned earlier that you can exploit the padding with your eco pick by picking that player from a team that starts deeper in the bracket, so that if they perform badly, it's kind of mitigated by the free points you get from those padding points. Now because of that, because of the team he is on, and his form during the group stage where if you didn't pick this player, you did not have a top team, it's gotta be HooXi. At 181k, he's actually had a price increase, but he's still the best player to pick if you want to capitalize on the padding. And the great thing about HooXi is he actually has great eco-friendly activation. It's actually a better role for him than Noob, so you don't get burned if he actually has a good performance, which sometimes he does. It also frees up the leader role to then throw onto a player that has poor role activation. He's also 9 to 10k cheaper than your Alexi Bs, your Apexes, your Snappies, and really, if you're above 190k, are you still an eco pick? Because of that logic, we're gonna look a little deeper into the bracket at a few players with some tantalizing prices. First up, Shuey. Now I guess he had a bit of a rough start to his tenure as Mouse's captain, but he's been bouncing back in the last month. With a 1.09 rating at EPL, and that included besting Heroic, he feels very underpriced at 176k. I mean, that's cheaper than JT, Mopos, and Carrigan. Now he does struggle a little bit with the role choices. I'd recommend either Defender or the leader role, if you do think that Mouse can do a deep run. A similar player that punches well above his price tag has got to be Cello. Coming in at 178k, he has fantastic activation on the headshot machine role. He also averaged a 1.06 rating through the groups. Now granted, this was against some lesser competition, but if you believe in Furia under Fallen, well, maybe he could be a good eco pick. This is a super exciting event with a lot of potential with where you could take your draft. And I have even mentioned simple. Just Don't be a pimp, and remember to submit your draft on time, and hopefully these tips have helped you out. Thanks again for tuning in to Fantasy Focus, brought to you by 22Bet.